we're finally in December, time to start getting festive, to get into the Christmas spirit, and what better way to get into the Christmas spirit than start it off with a good old Christmas movie. Merry Christmas? Hello guys and welcome to another Rewind review. Well, as I said in my intro, it is December, it is actually Christmas time, and I thought that one of the movies that I really wanted to do a review for this year was a movie that does take place in Christmas. It was released in 1992, and that is Batman Returns. Based on a DC Comics superhero, the sequel to 1989's Batman was once again directed by Tim Burton and written by Daniel Waters and Sam Hamm. This time around, while Batman deals with a deformed man calling himself the Penguin wreaking havoc across Gotham with the help of a cruel businessman, a female employee of the latter becomes the Catwoman with her own vendetta. Michael Keaton returns once again as Batman, as well as Michael Gough as Alfred, and Pat Hingle as Commissioner Gordon. Joining them this time around is Danny DeVito as the Penguin, Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman, Christopher Walken as Max Schreck, as well as Michael Murphy, Christy Conway, Andrew Briniarski, Vincent Schiavelli, Doug Jones, Diane Salinger and Paul Rubens. One thing that I've always found kind of funny in this movie is that even though I can always picture this film and I see the snow, I see the characters surrounded by all the cold and snow and everything, but I keep forgetting that it's actually supposed to be Christmas in this film. And it gets a lot funny when you realise that this actually came out in the summer. We don't get an awful lot of superhero movies that are set during Christmas time, but it is a really nice change of pace, especially visually. We've only really more recently started getting a few more festive oriented things such as Iron Man 3 from Shane Black, as well as the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. I don't know if this is the first comic book movie to really be set during Christmas time, but it's definitely the first one that I've seen. I can't even remember the first time I actually watched this movie because it was that long ago, and as I said in my review for the first Batman movie, I watched a lot of these out of order. I watched the Joel Schumacher movies first and then I moved on to the Tim Burton movies, but I watched this one first and then I watched the 1989 film. So this was my big introduction to Michael Keaton as Batman, the aesthetic that they've gone for with Tim Burton, his gothic sensibilities. It was quite an odd experience because most of my experience with Batman up to this point had been the Joel Schumacher movies and Adam West. I'd seen maybe like one or two episodes of the animated series, but I'd never really seen much of it, so I couldn't really say that I'd seen much dark Batman. So it was actually pretty cool getting to sit down and watch this. And eventually when I did get around to watching the 89 film, I did start picking up on a lot of the little references to that film, because Vicky Vale gets a few shout outs, there's a few references to the circus and clowns and things like that, which I didn't really pick up on. So that was fun. And even though I really liked it when I did watch it for the first time, I do remember feeling that this was a very odd movie, even though I was familiar with Tim Burton's films. And after all these years and getting to revisit it, that does still stand. I do still really enjoy this movie, I do get a lot of fun out of it. I love the performances from a lot of the cast members, but there are definitely issues, and I feel like because I'm a little bit older and I'm able to kind of understand a bit more of what's going on, I feel like I have a better understanding of what it is that I'm a bit mixed on. And then when I started looking into the movie and I started finding out about the history of it, I didn't realise just how much sort of controversy was around this movie. When the movie was initially released in '92, there were a lot of tie-in marketing around like toys and Happy Meals and all sorts, and parents were really annoyed that something that was kind of grown up was kind of being geared towards kids. Well, not really geared towards kids, but more like marketed towards them, with this merchandise being sort of like pushed towards it. I mean, they weren't annoyed when Terminator, Robocop and Aliens were getting released. Oh yeah, they had toys too. So just before I do get into the actual review for this, I do need to sort of bring that up, because I feel like when it comes to superheroes in general, especially characters like Superman and Batman, those characters, they have a very wide appeal, and I feel like they are meant to kind of be accessible to every audience. And even though I do feel like some of their stories might be a little bit more grown up and more oriented towards adults, I do feel like there needs to be a wider appeal to these characters, and I feel like having them be completely grown up, being completely dark, really does shut off that. Because even when I was young and I was starting to get into these movies, I was a bit annoyed that I wasn't really able to watch some of these movies because of the age rating, and I wasn't able to go near them. But I was thankful that there was other opportunities to see this character, like the animated series or Joel Schumacher. I know the Joel Schumacher movies probably aren't the best in terms of Batman movies, but as I said, the option was there. And in terms of the merchandise, I feel like when it comes to some of the more grown up franchises like Terminator and things like that, I feel like that's where it's a bit of a grey area. I'm not quite sure on that, but when it comes to Batman, I feel like toys and things like that, no problem with it being marketed towards kids because these characters do have that appeal, but when it comes to the actual movies, it's a bit more of a judgment call. Because prime example, when it comes to these movies, I was quite young when I did see both Tim Burton movies, and they are aimed at a slightly older audience, and they never fazed me. But when I get to watching The Dark Knight for the first time in the cinema, and I was old enough to go and see that one, that was actually a pretty traumatic movie. So I do genuinely feel like it is a judgment call on parents and whether or not kids get to see these films or not. My advice usually is go and watch the movie first and then decide whether your kids are going to be able to see it or not, and that definitely applies to this one. So let's get on with the review. When it comes to Michael Keaton as Batman, I think he is a brilliant choice for this role, and I really do love what he's able to do with this character. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that he's the definitive Batman that we've ever had, but I do feel like he is one of the better ones that we have had. Although he does feel quite normal whenever he is Bruce Wayne, whenever he's just with Alfred, but then when he turns into Batman, like, his voice gets a bit deeper, the way that his composure is, everything. I mean, the costume doesn't help, but he is really good once again. I really do think that he is one of the best Batman that we have had. That being said, in terms of his story in this one, I don't think he actually has that much of an arc this time around, because in the first movie the story was kind of split into two different parts. The first part being the Joker, the second part being the mystery around Batman and Bruce Wayne and what happened to him. This time around we know the answers, we know everything's being uncovered. We should have a bit more freedom with Batman to really sort of explore a bit more of who he is, and there are elements of it, but I don't feel like it's really enough because the focus of this movie is more so on the villains this time around, which isn't a bad thing because the villains are genuinely really fun in this, but I do feel like having the protagonist not really have much of a story, it does feel like they could have done a bit more, because I feel like there are ways around this, and I do feel like they wouldn't need to change the story up too much. It would just add a few little extra elements to it, and I feel like it might make this a little bit better. But as I said, when it comes to the villains, I do think that they are the best parts of this movie. I really love Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman. I think that up until Zoe Kravitz, I would have said that she was the best version of Catwoman that we've ever had on screen. She is very much Tim Burton's version of Catwoman, so this isn't the most accurate depiction of the character, but I do like what it is that they have done with her. It is definitely a little bit over the top at times, but I really do love what Michelle Pfeiffer does bring to this role, because not only is she able to embody who this character is, but even just like the physical side of things, because this is definitely a very demanding role, and even though there definitely are going to be stunt doubles involved here and there are moments where she kind of took over and she was able to do things herself. Like there's a scene where she breaks into Shrek's shop and she starts taking out all these mannequins with her whip, and according to several reports from people on set, she did it all in one take, and that's impressive. And when it comes to her story, I do like her motivation, I do like what it is that drives her, and I do think it is very well handled, and I do think the performance really does enhance that. The only thing I will say is a little bit 50-50 for me is that it does sort of feel like there might be a slightly more supernatural element to this one, because she does survive a lot of stuff in this. They do kind of play it up as because she's Catwoman, she has 9 lives, so they sort of play it into that a lot. And while it isn't really out of place, I do think that everything else in this movie does seem mostly grounded, where everyone is still human at the end of the day, and I feel like maybe that might have been just one step too far, and I think that maybe they could have just held back on that a little bit. And then when it comes to Danny DeVito as the Penguin, honestly, this is one of the most iconic versions of this character. Visually, this is what most people will think of when they think of the Penguin. And while I do think that DeVito's performance is absolutely phenomenal, I think he is absolutely brilliant in this movie, I do feel like his story and his motivations are probably some of the messier elements of this film, because they're trying to play up like the sympathetic side of him as well as like this monstrous grotesque side. It is a bit of a balancing act, and I don't feel like it 100% works, because his story really sort of starts off with him trying to discover who he is and where he comes from, but even that's a little bit muddled because that's not really what it is that he was doing a little bit earlier on in the movie. And then he starts getting manipulated by Max Schreck into wanting to become mayor, and then things just kind of escalate from there to the point where next thing you know he's angry at everyone, and he decides the only thing to do is to kill all the firstborns. It's a very overly simplified version of events, but that is kind of how it does sort of play out, and I do feel like maybe there could have been a slightly more natural path towards it, or maybe one extreme didn't necessarily need to be in this, especially when that all goes wrong and the next thing you know he decides to blow up the entire city. It's very similar to what they did with the Joker, where I feel like that really did escalate a little bit too fast, and I feel like there's a similar case here. How do the Penguins understand English? And even like the little flashback that you get with his parents, and I don't know how long it's supposed to be between his birth and when they do what they do, but it's just such a quick decision for them to make, and it is very extreme. The three characters are all united together by Shrek. He's the one who sort of like is the bridge between all three of the characters, and in many ways he is the main antagonist to this movie, which does work very well. And I do think that it is a really good way of having several characters' motivations being influenced and how it all does sort of weave together and interconnect. And in fairness, if you've got Christopher Walken in your movie, you use him. You don't really find out an awful lot about him, but I do like Shrek as a character. I do love the performance that Christopher Walken does give him. I think that he is a very fun addition to this film, and I do feel like he is integrated very well into this film and has a proper impact on the story. But at the same time, I do think that there are definitely ways around this that they could have gone, especially with the Penguin. Like, there's an episode of Batman the Animated Series where it does actually go into the Penguin a little bit more, and you see him getting out of prison and he wants to basically try and be accepted by society, and it's just the way that the people around him react that sort of force him to become a criminal. I feel like that, to me, is what they should have done in this one. The elements are all there, and I feel like it could have worked very well in this movie, and I feel like it would have even fed into maybe Bruce's arc a little bit here, because there is definitely parallels between him and Oswald Cobblepot, and I feel like maybe Bruce could have actually tried helping him, or at least sort of tried helping the world see him for who he is, because Bruce is a very isolated character. I would have thought that maybe he might have had a few like trust issues, because we don't know what's happened with Vicky Vale, whether she just sort of took off and didn't say anything. Like, that's never even really addressed. So I feel like both the Penguin story and what they could have done with Catwoman as well could have fed into that, and I feel like that could have benefited Bruce's story a lot more. But with the story that they did go with, I do like it, I do really enjoy it, but it is a little bit unbalanced. Because one element that they do add into this is Batman being framed for a murder, and I don't really know if it really kind of works because of like who the character is and how people sort of perceive him at this point in time. It just doesn't really sort of add up to me. It is an interesting idea for a movie to follow that story, but I don't feel like it really has enough focus in this to really have much significance. I feel like if they really did dig into that and have that be like the prime story, I feel like it could have been a really great movie. You know, Who Framed the Dark Knight? Force him to rely on his detective skills. I think that that could have been a really interesting story. Now, I know I did say that Batman killing is not really in his character, and when it comes to the Tim Burton version of Batman, he is a killer. He actually has killed several people on screen in these movies, and it doesn't really bother me too much in these movies because I feel like that is what it is that they've done with the Tim Burton films. I feel like that's just the portrayal of Batman that they've gone for. I'm not too keen on it on a lot of other versions because I feel like they either take it a little bit too far or it just doesn't quite work, because I feel like there are definitely a lot of stories and dynamics that are kind of undercut because that's now a thing. But that being said, whenever Batman does kill someone, it is kind of funny. It does make for some pretty fun action sequences. I feel like the action in this movie is a little bit better than it was in the first film. I do feel like there are definitely a lot of bigger set pieces this time around. I feel like the Batmobile car chase is definitely a little bit more imaginative with the way that it's able to kind of like disassemble apart and the way that it's able to sort of like weave in and out of the buildings. I think that's pretty cool. The actual fist fights are definitely quite fun as well. I do love it when Batman takes on the circus clowns and all those characters. I do like the fights between him and Catwoman, even though I do feel like they are very cheesy, and I feel like there are definitely moments that I would have trimmed, but they are fun. I do enjoy them. I think one of the reasons for that is the way that this movie looks, because this is out the 80s. Like the first movie definitely has a very 80s aesthetic to it. This one doesn't really have much of like a definitive aesthetic. It could so easily have been a very 90s oriented movie, but I feel like there's something in this that kind of feels almost timeless. Gotham definitely feels a lot bigger this time around. There seems to be a lot more to it. Really get to see it a lot more. I mean, when they were filming this, apparently 50% of the Warner Brothers lot was actually taken up by Gotham City streets. It doesn't really seem as run down as it was in the first movie, which is kind of a nice change because it was really grimy in the first one, so maybe that's meant to be kind of a reflection of what's been going on over in between the two movies. Well, I'm not really sure about that. I still think visually it's probably my second favourite version of Gotham that we've ever had. There was one thing I did wonder when I was watching this movie, when I was watching these movies in order, I did think, did this have a bigger budget than the first movie? And wow, it did. Because you can really tell from the way that everything looks, the costumes, the makeup, the sets, everything about it does seem a lot bigger. It really does seem like there was a lot more money thrown into this one. Because a good comparison is actually the finales of both the first and second movie, because The first movie does feel very sort of closed in with the way that it's just like the one street along with all the stuff in the tower. This time you've got all the stuff going on across the city, as well as all the stuff down in the sewers as well, and I think that it just feels so much bigger. And those sequences are absolutely fantastic. I really love the end of this film. I also think it's kind of impressive how they've sort of used the penguins in this, because yes, the penguin actually does have like actual penguins with him, like he that basically like raised him. Yeah, I'm starting to regret calling this movie grounded now. But I do like how it is a balance of real penguins. They had people in suits, they had animatronics. It works very well. There is a definite blur between them. You can't always tell what's what. This is a movie that did come out in the 90s, so of course most of it is very practical, and they have to rely on practical elements because they couldn't do a lot of CG effects back then, even though there are definitely attempts at doing that in this one. Like there's a scene where Batman uses like this remote control batarang where it like flies around knocking all the clowns out, and even though it is a fun sequence, it doesn't look good. I don't think the CGI really holds up very well, so I really do appreciate how practical a lot of this movie is, and I do feel like if they had tried doing a bit more CG, I don't feel like it would have worked as well. And that includes a lot of the vehicles in this, because like the Batmobile is one of the coolest things ever made, and I do really love this Batmobile. Even like his little speedboat thing that he uses down in the sewers, like it really does look really cool on screen. Plus like a lot of the vehicles that the circus gang use, like the remote control duck and all those, it's an odd decision visually, but it does work very well in this film. I do think it is kind of funny. I do kind of question where they get them from, but I'm guessing it might be from the circus, which I believe is where they do start off at in this movie. Yeah, even though it is completely over the top and very unrealistic, I do think it is handled well, and I do think it is incorporated very well into this film. But it's not necessarily just the big sequences that I really like in this, because there are definitely a lot more smaller scenes in this film that really do sort of echo like those old noir movies, and it fits this version of Batman. To be honest, noir fits Batman very well. I really love those scenes where he's like in the Batmobile and he's just driving up the road and he like goes past the place where the Penguin is. It's just that shot of his eyes, a close-up where he's just like keeping an eye on him. It just looks great. The use of shadows, the way that it's kind of foggy and smoky a lot of the time, and the music as well, it really does enhance that tone. I really do think it really fits the character and the style of this movie. Even though I do think the cinematography for this movie is definitely an improvement over the first one, there is one shot which I think is one of the weirdest parts of this movie. It's something that I sort of jumped on even when I watched it for the first time, because it was such an odd decision. Because during the first fight between Batman and Catwoman, there's a scene where she knocks him off a roof and then he's like sort of dangling there, and the camera perspective that they've gone for, it just looks like this really horrific CCTV, and it just, I really don't understand what they were going for. I'm glad it's just that one scene, but it really is an odd decision. It's such a nitpicky thing to jump on. When it comes to the costumes in this movie, I think that especially the main ones for Batman, Catwoman, the Penguin, I think they look really good. I definitely think this is definitely one of the more iconic looks that each of these characters have had. Even though I do have a slight preference towards the grey-black costumes that Batman does have, I do like the look of this costume. I like how it does feel like it has evolved from what it was in the first film, especially in like the mask where it actually looks like it fits a bit more. It's not too different from what it was in the first film, but there are definitely subtle changes, including the logo as well, which I really do like. And also the way that the lighting is on it sometimes, it does give it a slightly bluer tinge, which I do like. I've definitely got a bit of a soft spot for the blue and grey costume that Batman has, so I really would like to see that on screen at least once. And with Catwoman, I do feel like, even though I do like the costume overall, I do feel like there are definitely a few leaps made within logic, because she basically uses like a leather jacket to create this costume, and I don't think there's that much material actually used, but it does look fine. I do think it is an interesting choice, having all the little white stitches showing it all sort of come together. Visually it does look very good, but I wouldn't necessarily say it was like the definitive Catwoman look. Like, for me personally, most of the looks of these characters, the best versions of them are in the Arkham games, and I feel like with Catwoman that's definitely the case here. I do appreciate what they were trying to do with this interpretation of it in terms of the costume. I do feel like it does fit very well within this continuity. And as I said, when it comes to the Penguin, I feel like this is definitely the most iconic he's ever looked. I do really love how the Penguin looks in these films. There are definitely a few costumes that do sort of echo the 80s here and there, and there is a little bit of 90s inspiration here and there, but I do feel like this does kind of feel bit more timeless than what it was in the 80s, as I said a little bit earlier. And I feel like Shrek is actually a really good example of this, because I actually do really like his look in this. I do feel like they were kind of going a bit of a Two-Face direction with him. It definitely does have a few little influences here and there, almost to the point where I do wonder, was Harvey Dent meant to be in this? Was Billy D. Williams, Two-Face, meant to actually make an appearance in this? It would definitely need a rewrite in order to try and adapt his character faithfully into this compared to how he was in the first film, but I do think that it could have worked, and I feel like it really would have been an interesting direction for them to have gone in. I do feel like the costumes in this movie are really good, including like the circus. They all do feel very much Tim Burton inspired. I feel like this is very much a Tim Burton movie. That is kind of how I've always pictured this film. I don't necessarily see this as like a straight up Batman movie. I see this as Tim Burton's Batman, and the costumes and the aesthetic are a big part of that. I do like the party sequence where Bruce and Selena end up meeting again, and it's supposed to like they're so tired of wearing masks that it's during a masquerade ball and they're the only two that aren't wearing anything. It is a good scene. I do think that is definitely one of the better scenes in this movie, and it is something that is echoed in The Dark Knight Rises. I also think it's kind of funny that if you actually watch the background, there's actually a guy walking around with a Flash helmet on, like the Jay Garrick one. Some nice foreshadowing there. But one thing that really does enhance a lot of the costumes in this movie is the makeup, and the makeup is absolutely brilliant, because it really does enhance a lot of the visuals of this movie, especially when it comes to like Michael Keaton and Michelle Pfeiffer, because like one of the things that I do notice in these movies is like their eyes whenever they've got the costumes on, because of like all the eyeliner around them. It really does help those eyes like really stand out, and I really do like how that looks. And since I mentioned it, I might as well bring up the makeup gate in this movie, because it is a really odd decision why in pretty much every single interpretation of Batman on screen live action, he's always had black eyeliner around his eyes just to make them sort of pop a little bit more. And there is a scene in this movie where he takes his mask off and the makeup's just completely disappeared. Like, it's not even a case of like when the mask comes off it's disappeared, it's right before he does, and you can see it in the little eye holes. It's really weird. I don't know why they couldn't have just cut around it, but it's fine. It doesn't really take out the movie or anything, but it's just a really odd decision. I did appreciate movies like Kick-Ass and The Batman actually sort of showcasing that in some way, but it's never really bothered me, so it's fine. But in the makeup, when it comes to the Penguin, I think that is absolutely phenomenal what they have done with him, how they've been able to really make him look real. They have managed to capture who the character is, plus adding to the performance of Danny DeVito. I think that it really does sell this character. He is definitely grotesque, and he does kind of come across like this monstrous beast at times, and that is through the performance, but as well they are able to bring so much sympathy to him as well. And I think that if the makeup was any more than it was or any less, I don't know if both of those elements could have come through. I really do think he looks great. There is one thing that I'm not 100% sure, and that's like all the black ink that he has like coming out of his mouth and his teeth and everything. I don't really understand what that was. I think it was meant to be like they sort of like blackened his teeth or something, because like all he eats is fish, and I feel like that was what they were trying to do, but it sort of keeps like running out and he keeps spitting it whenever he's talking. I don't really understand that, but again, it doesn't really bother me too much, and I feel like especially when it comes to his performance, I feel like even to this day I know it's Danny DeVito playing that character, and I still have to question it because it just does not look like him at all, and his performance, he just completely disappears. That is the Penguin on screen. For the music in this movie, Danny Elfman returns once again to provide the score for this film, and I do think it is a really great soundtrack. I really do love the Batman theme. It is definitely one of the more iconic themes that Danny Elfman has created, and I do feel like his music for this one is just as good as it was in the first. There is definitely a lot of subtle differences this time around, because this one does feel a little bit more grander. There's a bit more of a tragic element to it. It's like it really does embrace the gothic side of everything. There's no Prince this time around, and I feel like that's one of the things that really sort of makes this movie feel a bit more timeless, because even though I really do like the Prince songs from the first movie, it does kind of cement it in the 80s, and I feel like not having that sort of music in this one, I feel like does make it feel a bit more timeless. There are a few songs here and there that do pop up throughout it, but they are very subtle and they're just in the background, but they do work very well into the soundtrack and they do fit each scene. I've got to give a special shout out to Shirley Walker on this movie, because her orchestration is a big part of why the music is so good, and it's that good that she got chosen to do the main themes for Batman the Animated Series, so I'm really glad that she was able to work on this movie. It's just a shame that she doesn't really get a lot of credit for that. Overall, I do think that this is going to be a bit different from what most people are probably expecting from a Batman movie, and I do feel like the reaction to it will be a little bit mixed. And even though, yeah, there are definitely things that I do question in this one, I do really enjoy it. I do have a lot of fun. I love the performances, I love the music, the costume, the aesthetics. Most of this movie is really good, and I feel like if you are a fan of Batman, if you're a fan of Tim Burton, I honestly would recommend checking this movie out. You don't have to watch the first movie in order to see this one and enjoy it, because case in point, I saw this one first and it didn't bother me one way or another. I did enjoy it overall. I am very curious to see what it was that Tim Burton would have done with the third movie and what direction he would have gone with it, but I'm fine with the two movies that he did make, because I do think that they are very good and I do feel that they are very distinct against a lot of the other Batman movies that we have had. So with all that being said, my rating for Batman Returns is 7 out of 10. Not the best Batman movie ever made, but I do think that it is really enjoyable. Well, that is pretty much everything we've got to say for this episode, so thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this content, please like, please subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on here. If you've seen the movie, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Also, if you have any suggestions for any future rewinds you want me to do, whether it's films, TV, games, let me know down below. I've got a few more videos planned for the end of the year, so keep an eye out for those. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.